I am Mickey Pacini. My real name is Mabel. Before I was married, it was McCann. And I was born in a little town in Illinois on a big estate. We lived there for a few years, and then we moved into the little town of Lakeville, and we lived there till I was 12 years old. And my grandma died, and it was during the Depression, and so then we moved in with my grandfather to help him out. And of course my dad wasn't working, so it was a good deal. I mean, all six of us moved in, and we had more than just eggs to eat. He had a small farm, and he had 2 horses and 2 cows. And it was a huge home. It was like moving into a hotel.
Does Mickey remind you of anybody? I'm sure that Mickey is celebrating her 97th St. Patrick's Day today, so she was a real treat for us to interview. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to focus on our specific part of the presentation, which was on preserving memories. So I'm not a dementia expert like Lori is, but my business partner and I have been journalists and storytellers for most of our careers. Ren has been a filmmaker since before there was film, I think. And I've been a journalist and been interviewing people for many, many years. And we decided to form a company a couple of years ago where we would record people's memories. So you'll see various clips during our presentation today of some of the work we do, but we're not just going to talk about video, we're going to talk about other ways to preserve memories. We're going to talk specifically about the value of recalling memories and recording them. We're going to talk about some of the formats that you might consider for your residents for preserving memories. We're going to talk about some interviewing techniques that I use when I talk with older adults. I'm going to give you all my tips and secrets for that, so you can conduct your own interviews. And we're going to talk about some ideas for promoting recall. And that sometimes is important in any interview, whether it's an individual who's beginning to have some memory issues or any of the people that we've interviewed for our work. And by the way, you're going to see a number of clips. These were all clips that were developed for people to share with their families. They're not meant to be a Ken Burns documentary, but they are very personal. And so you'll notice that that they are very unique, and but they were not meant for Hollywood broadcast. So all of the people have given us permission to use some of their personal stories. So I just want to let you know that up front. So why would we bother to record memories? Well, it's one of the things that reinforces our sense of self and tells us about who we are and where we've come from. Telling stories is really one of the things that makes us uniquely human. We're the only creatures on the planet that I know of who gather around the fire and tell stories. So it's important to what it makes us human beings. Not all of our memories are going to be happy ones, right? But a lot of times when we talk with people, we do hear about times of struggle or adversity, and there's a certain pride that comes out of that because it shows that we're strong, that we were able to meet a challenge and come through it. And we come out on the other side knowing more about ourselves and our abilities. It connects us with others. Our memories are connected to other people. We very rarely have memories. We go to tell stories about our lives. They almost always involve some other person. So it connects us with these people, both past and present. And it can even connect us with future people when we talk about our stories and our lives. Another thing about connecting is that it helps tell our children and our grandchildren that we are about us as a person, that we're more than just mom or grandma, that we had a whole life before our children were born, right? And it can be very therapeutic. What we find when we talk with people in these interviews is they say afterward, you know, I hadn't taken stock of my life like this before. Or you made me think about things I haven't thought about in a long time. Or, you know, there's a certain theme here that I hadn't noticed before in my life. And so we're going to show you another video clip. So basically it's healthy. And I'll come back to that in a little bit, but I want to show you a clip where this is probably the youngest couple we've ever interviewed. And I asked him, how did you know your wife was the one? And of course I got an answer that I was completely not expecting at all. And it turns out that it was a way for him to sort of tell the story about how the timing in his life of meeting his wife was tied to his father. So,
how did I know Kim was the one? Well, my dad was very, very sick at the time, and I was in my late 20s, and the doctors said, you know, everybody better come home. We don't know if your dad's going to make it. So we were all gathered around the bed, and he asked my mom and two sisters to leave the room, and he talked to me, and my dad didn't do this very often, but he says, you know, look at how sick I am right now. And he said, what's really important is family. I mean, your two sisters are here and you're here, and if your mother didn't have that kind of support, it would be really difficult. He says, you need to get a little more serious about your relationships. And I had just started dating Kim at that time, and I knew she was the one from the first time I met her.
but basically it was kind of very therapeutic for him to hear this from his dad. And just to kind of underscore that therapeutic value of recalling memories, there's been some research done in the UK, actually at the University of Southampton, that shows that recalling memories actually counteracts loneliness, and it makes us feel more tolerant of, more generous to strangers, and more tolerant, I got ahead of myself there a little bit, to outsiders. Wow, you know, couldn't we use some of that in our world today? Exactly. So according to the researchers, and I'm just going to read this because I think it's so interesting, the net effect is to make life seem more meaningful and death less frightening. When people speak wistfully of the past, they typically become more optimistic and inspired about the future. So wonderful, isn't it, to think about that? Okay, and just to talk just a little bit more about the value of it, because I feel very strongly about this. We tend to be overly modest, especially I think those of us who grew up in the Midwest, and we think, oh, I haven't done anything important, my life's not that interesting. Yes, it is. Your life is interesting. You are part of the fabric of humanity. And the very things that we think of as being mundane now actually become part of history in just a few years. Another part is legacy. You know, we won't have, at least I won't have, my name on a tower. It's not going to be on an art museum. My legacy is basically not really what I might have to leave to my son for material possessions, but my stories and my wisdom and the knowledge I have of my family that only I have, I can pass on to him. And it's really a gift. It's a gift both to the person, to be present with them, and it's a gift to the listener as well.
You're lucky to have one or two really true friends in your life. People who are there and stay there in your life. You know, people tend to come and go. You know, it can be a year or two, it can be 20 years, but family is there for the long run, whether they want to be or not. And it's actually rather comforting to know that. I'm not real close to every one of my cousins or, you know, second, third cousins, but I honestly think if I needed something, they would be there.
So we've talked obviously about video memories. There are other formats, and obviously one of the most common ones that you're probably more familiar with are the written, and that can take the form of a memoir or an autobiography. It can be a series of short stories, and it could even be what's known as an ethical will. And there are whole books written about ethical wills and workshops, and you probably in your work have encountered this before. They're not memoirs, but they're more stories about your values and your blessings for your children, your wisdom. And sometimes they're referred to as legacy letter. And sometimes people write letters to family members to be perhaps opened on a special day in their future. So maybe you have a new granddaughter and you write a letter to her that you want her to open on her wedding day. So that's another form of a written legacy or written personal history. There are also obviously visual ways to do this, and that takes the form of photo albums, or in my case, photo boxes. I'm sure I'm the only person here who has boxes of loose photographs, right? No, I'm not? Oh, okay. Good to know. Good to know. There are photo sharing websites such as Flickr, SmugMug. There's a Shutterfly is another one that I've heard about and actually used a couple of times. Scrapbooks. There's been a tremendous interest in scrapbooking, and that again, it's a visual memoir. Annotated recipes. I've seen people do whole books full of family recipes, but they include photographs and stories with them. So that's a wonderful way to preserve some family memories. Memory quilts. I'm sure some of you have seen some of those at your facilities. And even drawings and paintings. So obviously ways to record some family memories and history. And then of course there's audio visual. There's audio, which is a very easy thing to do. Most of us have an audio recorder now on our phones, right? So you can set it down in the middle of the table and ask your family to talk. Just talk about a particular occasion or interview someone, ask their questions. It's easy to do and it's very inexpensive. And then there are video recordings, which of course you can tell we're pretty passionate about. And we feel that way because it's such a powerful medium. You know, you have the ability to record not only their words, but their laughter and their mannerisms and the kind of quirky things about people that you just, you can't capture in a written memoir or a photo even. Both Ren and I have had the experience of losing our parents. My mom died very suddenly, and I don't have any record of her voice. Ren's often mentioned that his father died relatively young, and he no longer remembers. He can't remember what his voice sounded like. So have any of you ever known or worked with somebody who had left their partner's greeting on the answering machine? Yeah. Just because they couldn't erase it? Yeah. And also because it was maybe the only thing they had left of that person's voice. So audio and video are very powerful. They bring in all of the senses and help us remember people in a very unique way. Okay, so speaking of video, the next one is Dr. Renata Laksova. She's a longtime Madison resident. Fascinating person. She's a retired professor of genetics. Do you know her? Have you heard? Oh, this is wonderful. Yeah, great. She was a Jewish child in the Czech Republic at the time that Hitler's troops were coming in to close the borders. And there was a man in England, Sir Nicholas Winton, who organized a train, and it was called the Kinder Transport, that would pick children up in Prague and take them to the coast where they got on a ferry, and then they went and lived with families in England. They were, for the duration of the war. One person who did that. They referred to him as England's Schindler. So if you're familiar with Schindler's List, Nicholas Winton was England's Schindler. And so we had an opportunity to interview her last year, and she talks about her mother writing a letter to Sir Nicholas Winton, and that's what you'll see in this video.
My mother's friends, when she wrote the letter, laughed at her. I don't know that they ridiculed her, but and this was not about the Kindertransport. She wrote a very personal, we didn't know about their existence yet. She wrote a personal letter just saying that she had heard his speech and appreciated it, and she believed what he believed. That is, that Hitler meant business and was going to annihilate the Jews and maybe other nations, and that he was a terrorist. And That was the letter, to which we got the very quick answer, saying, thank you for your letter. We will do whatever we can to get your little girl to safety to England.
You're thinking, okay, you have all these different formats, which one do I choose? And you really need to think about what your purpose is for your residents or for yourself. If it's something you want to share with others, share with family, it needs to be in some kind of a format that's easily shared. Maybe your purpose is to contribute to history. So for example, StoryCorps. How many of you are familiar with StoryCorps? It's okay, it's a nonprofit organization that simply exists to collect stories, all kinds of stories. And in fact, they have a whole section, initiative devoted to memory loss. And you'd have to kind of drill down in their website to find it, but it's a whole series of basically booklets that tell you as an organization how to do this in your facility. So StoryCorps, there's also the Library of Congress is collecting veteran stories. So if you know a veteran, and some of you probably have veterans living in your facilities, or if it's just for your own enjoyment or for the person's own enjoyment and their enlightenment, then maybe it doesn't need to be an audio or video. If you have the ability to form groups and have, you know, a writing group where you have each person take a week as the storyteller of the week and have other people interview them. And if you had the ability to just put down a recorder and record that, think how wonderful that would be to give to your residents and to their families. Involve volunteers. Again, just real simple to sit down and interview people about their lives. Retain a personal historian. And here's where I'll make a plug for the Association of Personal Historians, which we're members of. There are people all over the country and North America actually who will help people with writing their personal histories or recording their personal histories. And again, I'll have a slide at the end that has that. They have a number of resources. And then invite families to get involved. And this is hard because we don't always live close to our grandparents anymore. But what a great opportunity if you have grandchildren to come in and say, here's the list of questions. Start with these. Why don't you ask your grandma about how she met grandpa? You know, what was it like growing up on a farm? You know, tell me about your first pet, those kinds of things. And kids, when they get started, they really enjoy this as much as we do. It's a gift for them as well to get to know their grandparents. So here's where I'm going to go into sort of my techniques for interviewing. And a number of these things are probably very familiar to you because I have a feeling that a lot of you conduct interviews when you're assessing people to maybe enter your facilities, for example. But ask open-ended questions. And you know what those are, right? Those are the kinds of questions that you don't just answer with a yes or a no. They're the questions that say, what, or how, or tell me about. So ask the open-ended questions. Focus on the stories and not so much on the facts. You can get the facts elsewhere. And if you have somebody who's dealing with memory loss, you know, sometimes the facts are a little hard. But if the stories, you want to hear about my first pet? Oh, let me tell you about that, you know. So focus on the stories and the more colorful things that you can talk about. Practice active listening. So that means, of course, making eye contact, nod, okay, that's interesting. Really? Tell me more, okay? And you'll be surprised. Sometimes once you get people going, you may have trouble getting them to stop. But you want to avoid correcting them. And I think this is true, hard, especially if you have like adult children talking to their parents. They're like, no, Mom, it was Lake Wabisa, it was not Lake Kiganza, you know, and that just kind of shuts somebody down. We're in the middle of telling a story, so just kind of let it go. It's okay, you know, it's their story. It's how they remembered it. And don't pressure. You know, sometimes we, especially if we're talking to people we know, oh, he's got a great story about the time he went fishing and he put his foot right through the bottom of the boat. And the day you go to ask them that story, they're like, what? So don't pressure, you know, maybe if you have the opportunity to come back to it another day, that story may be there and crisp and clear. So remember that this should be fun, and for both you and for the teller. So the kinds of questions that I would recommend, and again, I'm kind of getting into sort of my area techniques that I've been using for a long, long time, and that is you start off with the easy questions. So you start off with the what and the where, things you know that people can answer, before you move on to the why and the how. And those are often the ones that become more emotional. And so it's best to start off, like I said, start off easy, and then kind of work your way into those more personal questions. Why did you do this? How did you know she was the one? You know, why did you choose that career? Those kinds of questions will be a little bit harder to answer. And I think when you're working with people who have memory issues, when is going to be really challenging. So focus again on that. And keep the tissues handy, because I don't know that we've ever had an interview where there wasn't maybe 1 or 2 tears that come up. When people start talking about the past and about their families, there's going to be some emotion involved. So keep those tissues handy, and you might be surprised. It might be you who is the one crying. And it does trigger emotions. It triggers both happy and sad. But for the most part, like we talked about earlier, even the sad memories are sometimes healthy and therapeutic to recall and work through some of those issues. If you happen to know the person, if you're working with somebody who's, again, maybe starting to lose a little bit of the memory, if you can provide some kind of a context for them, that's very helpful for them. Okay, so I know you met Mom at a dance. Tell me more about that. How did you feel about her the first time you saw her? Also, if you can ask about a favorite story, we talked about that earlier. If you know these people, you know that they've got some of their routine ones, some of their very favorites. But if you give them an opportunity to talk a little bit more or ask a few questions, you might get some context that you hadn't heard before. I know that certainly was true with my own family. And be flexible. As you know, you go in with a list of questions, and what you come out with may be completely different from what you thought you were going to get. So my question to Steve earlier, how did you know Kim was the one? Well, turns into a story about his dad on his deathbed. So be flexible and be willing to go down that path, because the real story may not be the one that you thought it was going to be going in. You really do want to establish that trust and to let people know it's okay. It's okay to open up here and share information with me. Okay, so what are some ways to trigger memories? Okay, this is something that I haven't seen a lot of in the other resources. Some, obviously, letters and postcards are great ways to trigger memories, particularly postcards, vacations, trips, and we all have them, right? We all have boxes of postcards. Photos are very powerful to evoke memories. Books sometimes, maybe not as much as the photos. Movies sometimes bring back memories, and certainly music. So now we have another video. This is a World War II veteran who sent a box of memorabilia home from the island of Saipan. And here he is talking about it about 70 years later.
Oh, you want to see what's inside?
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's 2 caps. This here's a notebook I started right after I went in, Shepherd Field, Texas. I don't suppose it's any good to eat anymore. It's eat cold. About 70 years ago, I guess that's what it was, a kind of a ration that I got. It's pretty good looking them days.
So it was really wonderful to have that. Ren and I filmed him on Father's Day in 2013. And 6 months later, he went into the nursing home, and he never would have been able to record that. But he had lived on the same farm. He farmed until he was 90. and the farm that he grew up on, spent his whole life in this small town, except for this 4-year adventure during World War II when he had the most amazing experience. He flew with Colonel Tibbets, who was the pilot who piloted the Enola Gay, and traveled all over the US and to the South Pacific. And I didn't hear those stories growing up. He was too busy farming, and I just didn't hear them. But then as he got older and he slowed down some, I started to hear more and more about it. It's like, really? And now I'm realizing he was a witness to history and that voice, of course, is silenced just a few months later. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about resources, and certainly StoryCorps is the one I would suggest, and drill down to the part where they talk about memory loss initiative. Like I said, it's not right on the front page, so maybe you have to look a little bit for it. And they have a whole series of booklets, how to set up a commemorate project, as they call it. They'll tell you what kind of audio equipment to buy. They have books for the interviewer and the storyteller. And in their case, they also have a facilitator. So that person is responsible for the audio equipment. And it's really a well thought out program that they were able to do with some funding. Also, the Association for Personal Historians. Again, that's people who do what we do, professional people who help people with their memoirs and their autobiographies, videos, audios, and they have a number of resources on their website. And then you can find both of those on our webpage, which is lifemessagesmedia.com, and we have several links in our resources section that will take you both to StoryCorps and the Association of Personal Historians, and some other resources that I think you might find very helpful. So thank you so much for being an attentive audience.
Yeah.